Peter Zeihan, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
So I have to say, I'm so excited we could get in contact. Not only did I love your book, but we actually worked at the same company, which is two things I did not expect after picking that up.
Let's see, I left Stratfor about 8 years ago. I worked from 2000 to 2012 there.
Okay, great. Awesome. So we have some, preconceived biases that we can share about the world that we can explore in this pod. So your newest book, Disunited Nations, just came out, which I really enjoyed. First, just to give the audience an idea of what the book is about, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you currently see the global system and what you think is going to change or is already changing?
So, short version, the world that we understand, globalization, international trade, air travel, global finance, global energy, all of it is a side effect of a strategic program the Americans put into effect back in the 1940s and early 1950s. After the liberation of Europe at the end of World War II, we found ourselves facing down Stalin's army, and honestly, it scared the crap out of us. And so we had to figure out a way of convincing Europe, which had just finished a series of civil wars among themselves that were the most destructive in history, to line up shoulder to shoulder for common cause and face down the Soviets, not with us, but in front of us, because we knew that we would never be able to get troops there in time if a new war broke out. So we bribed them. We basically paid everybody to be on our side. We used our military to create a global order that allowed any country to go anywhere and purchase any commodity, ship it home, metabolize it into a finished good, and then re-export it largely to our market in order to grow themselves back into being successful countries again. And over time, this was expanded from not just the victorious allies in Europe, but to the Germans and to the Japanese and to the Koreans and the Taiwanese, and eventually to almost the entire world, including the developing world. That is what created the world that we know. What has now changed is that the United States has lost interest. Ever since 1992, at the end of the Soviet period, the strategic rationale for our involvement has steadily dropped, and we have lacked the political leadership on either side of the aisle to come up with a replacement grand strategy. And so we've just been on autopilot for 30 years, and Donald Trump is the president who is kind of ushering in the end. Now, if we had had a President Hillary Clinton, we'd probably be doing the same thing. We'd just be a little bit more organized about it. We'd probably be using the State Department more and Twitter less. But it would get us to the same location. That's kind of piece one. Piece two is demographics. People in their 20s act different from people in their 40s, act different from people in their 60s and their 80s. And what has happened is, as the world has industrialized and urbanized since World War II, in part because of the global order, the global population has changed. It used to be we had a population pyramid with lots of children on the bottom, very few retirees at top. And what's happened, it's kind of inverted now. So we've got this huge bulge of people in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Europe that are in their 50s and 60s. They just never had a lot of kids. So the younger part of the population is hollowed out. And when you're in your 50s and your 60s, you don't consume as much, but you're very productive. So this whole export-led economic model that we see in so many places, that's a direct outcome of this. Well, 10 years after you're in your 50s, you're in retirement. And in this decade, pretty much every significant country except for two age into mass retirement, which means that this global economic structure that is based upon the export of goods and the consumption of goods elsewhere, that was going to end anyway this decade. The two countries of significance that don't have this population structure are France and the United States. And that is not enough to maintain a global order, specifically since the Americans don't care anymore. So for economic reasons and for strategic reasons, this was all going to end in the next few years anyway. And what coronavirus has done is speed it up. I'm glad that the book didn't come out any later than it did. It came out the week that the United States was starting to realize that this might be a real thing. But we're looking at all these countries that are export-led. If they were smart, they were starting to explore how they could change their economic and political systems to work in a world without America, in a world without trade, in a world without global energy or global finance, in a world without mass consumption. That's a big step. It's a heavy haul. Mm-hmm. What coronavirus has done is taken their transition time and they removed it. Most countries will never recover to where they were in February. which means that most countries now have a political and economic system that is doomed to be on history's ash heap. I mean, this really is the end for a lot.
Yeah, I guess if this book came out in June, people would have been like, well, you think? But
yeah, I know, kind of a letdown.
So you talk about 5 specific countries that you think are uniquely well positioned for the post order. What are those countries, and what are just, you talk about demographics. What are the general facets of power that you think are really going to matter in what follows the current system?
Well, demographics is a piece of it. And remember, none of these are deterministic. They all help. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have any of them, you're kind of screwed. But just because you don't have all of them, that doesn't mean you're not going to succeed. So a demographic structure that's sustainable. So if, the bulk of your population is in its 50s now, it's really hard to get past that. So preferably a younger population with at least replacement level population growth, and maybe a political system that is relatively friendly towards immigration. That's one. Number 2, you need an energy structure that allows you to literally keep the lights on and keep your place running. If you don't have the ability to generate your energy locally, whether it's from something like the shale revolution or a good solar quotient, at least have a neighbor that you're on good terms with that you can bring in energy from. Third, you got to be able to feed your people. Or again, like with energy, have a neighbor that can help you out with that. But most importantly, you've got to have good geographic barriers between you and your neighbors. You've got to make sure that it's very difficult for other countries that might be hostile to reach you in the first place. But on the flip side, you've got to make sure the interior of your country is flat and open enough that you can actually integrate politically. Chechnya is not a successful country. The Russians are right on the border. It's a mountainous place. It's very clannish. Because of the mountains, they fight at each other. Think West Virginia. There aren't very many places in the world that have this kind of setup. Really, there's only 5. The US is far and away the most powerful of all of them. In Europe, it's the French. We like to make fun of the French in the Anglosphere for being, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, I believe is what the Simpsons called them.
That's what Willie, the groundskeeper, called them, yes.
Yeah, but we forget that aside from the United Kingdom, the French have won more wars in their history than any other country in the world. It's just because we've got that little Anglo split that we like to poke fun of them anymore. They're a wildly successful country that has been around as a culture for 1,500 years. They're not going anywhere. And they don't border any of the countries that are likely to be security threats to them in the future. So really the future is theirs to lose. In the Middle East, Turkey, forget Saudi Arabia, forget Iran. Those are 2 countries that are going to be locked into a Faustian death match here in not too distant future. That leaves it to Turkey to inherit the region. In East Asia, it's not China. China is one of the most vulnerable countries in human history. And the only reason it's been successful for the last 70 years, especially the last 40, is because of the American-led order. We broke up the empires, we allowed global trade, and all of a sudden they unified really for the first time. When the Americans leave, that's the end of the Chinese. It's Japan that's going to rule the future. It's Japan that has the world's 2nd largest navy, and it's Japan that really hasn't faced a successful invasion of the home islands ever. Oh yeah, South America, Argentina. Yeah, Argentina. It's everybody talks about Brazil, but Brazil's economic success is really a side effect of the order. Global finance has allowed them to overcome a lot of their internal geographic problems, whether it's the tropics or rugged terrain or insatiable Chinese demand for their products. But Argentina doesn't need any of that. And in the world that we're going to, rule of law is going to break down. Finance will be hard to come by. Transport will be difficult. International contract law will basically vanish. And, that's what the Argentines call their average Tuesday. They know how to operate in that environment. So it's either Argentina is going to reform itself and move to the median and past it, or Argentina is going to stay exactly as it is, and the median is going to move to them and past them. Either way, in relative terms, Argentina's future looks very bright.
So I do want to get into your Chinese bearishness at some point. Sure. But first, as this is a Slavic podcast, I would love to hear your evaluation of Russia, as they're definitely a country who can support themselves energy-wise, but are not one fond of strong barriers or good relations with their neighboring countries.
Russia proper, forget kind of the near abroad area. Russia proper has absolutely no barriers separating it from its neighbors. There are 11 major invasion routes. All of them have been used multiple times in their history. And the primary reason that the Russians are always so damn paranoid is because they're actually aware of their own history. It's not an unwise position. Now, we can all argue over whether or not the world has changed or whether or not a different policy at a different time would have generated a different result. Those are all legitimate conversations to have. But the bottom line is that Russia is one of the most insecure nations in human history. And in the roughly 800-year history of the Russian people, it's just been the story of invasion one after the other after the other. In addition, the climate patterns, not just the fact that it's a cold place, but the erratic nature of the jet stream as it goes over Russia means that they get floods and they get droughts. And there is no such thing as an average agricultural year. And that grinds on you. And simply ruling something like this, where the year in, year out challenges are so big from a security point of view and a financial point of view and a transport point of view and an agricultural point of view, it's no shock that this is not a land that is particularly fertile for democracy. So what do? You expand until you can build up a series of subject nations that are cannon fodder to fend off invasions, until you eventually reach barriers like the Alma-Ata Mountains or the Carpathians that you can kind of hunker behind. And the reason that the Soviet Union was a superpower is because they were able to do that in the closing days of World War II. And they were able to actually form a hard shell in a way that the Russians had never experienced before. That was piece one. Piece two, ironically, was the global order. Because when the Americans broke up all the empires, that included all the empires that had traditionally gone to war with Russia, whether it was Japan or Britain or Germany or whatever else. So the Russians found themselves in the most secure environment they had ever been in their history. And with the exception of the Americans, everyone else was under lockdown strategically. The Americans didn't allow any of their allies to stir up trouble in Russia because they didn't want to have a broad-scale conflict. That lasted until 1992, which is, of course, is when the economic fallacies of the communist system eventually broke loose and crushed the entire system. Russia today is the most insecure that it's been in 300 years in terms of geographic boundaries. And so it's no surprise that a government such as Vladimir Putin's is taking a harsher line with dissidents. And Russia moving forward has two problems, one midterm, one short term. The midterm problem is demographic. Russia is one of the least healthy demographies in the world. It's one of the fastest aging in the world. And even if you believe Russian statistics, and they just keep making up millions of children that they shove into the demographic data, which is, just hilarious, I personally find, but is doing nothing to actually improve their situation. The country is quite literally dying out. That's the midterm situation. The short-term situation is COVID. Because the Russian educational system collapsed in 1990, there's not much of an intelligentsia left in the country, particularly when it comes to technical skills. For example, medical. So there weren't a lot of nurses and doctors left in the country anyway, because there hasn't been a lot of throughput into those sectors in 15, 20 years. And because the FSB has the ear of the president and is taking issues like propaganda and national pride very seriously, when you get doctors starting to protest and talk publicly about not having sufficient supplies to treat populations, we've seen a number of cases of doctors tying themselves to chairs and throwing themselves out of windows. And this is a very precious commodity right now. Mm-hmm. These people are not replaceable. So you get a short-term health crunch in a country that is already unhealthy, that already has a terminal demography. And then COVID, of course, has driven oil prices down below $20 a barrel. Urals, the last time I checked last week, was selling for $7. So the Russian budget is imploding in a way that they can't manage. The Saudis have like $2 trillion that they can fall back on. The Russians cannot win a price war with the Saudis. I don't want to say that this is the end of the Russian state, but I've always said that this is the last generation of the Russian state. So the question now is, with a health crisis, with a budget crisis, and with a security crisis, and then with the Americans stepping back and letting countries like Sweden and Germany and Poland and Turkey and Japan and China do whatever they want, this is kind of the ultimate storm that is forming up and hitting Russia from every level, from every direction.
what does the military aspect play into this then? I mean, Russia's had 4% GDP to military for decades. Is that going to arrest their decline, or do you think that's just putting them in a worse economic position?
Anyone who looks at Russian economics and tries to compare them to any other country, in my opinion, is kind of looking at it the wrong way. Russia has never been an efficient economy. It has never been particularly value added. And the Russian government is always willing to make the population suffer in the name of security. And most Russians agree to that bargain. Life is so insecure in Russia, historically speaking, and honestly within living memory. Yeah. The 2007 to 2009 crisis was awful. The 1990s were just retching. The 1970s, the high point of the Soviet Union is not perceived that way in Russia because the Brezhnev years were awful. The Russian citizens, Russian culture is very tolerant of that. And not to be overly blunt, but most of the people who don't believe that way in Russia emigrated a long time ago. And so we now have people who are 21 who know nothing other than the Putin government. And what they know is, compared to their history, which was insecure, at least now they've got food and electricity. It's hard to argue with that. It's not that these people have been brainwashed. It's that they actually understand the situation that they're in. Moving forward with defense, I mean, the Russians have some new stuff that is very good, world class. And then they've got a lot of really, 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 really old stuff that dates back to the 80s or before. How they would do in a real war is an open question, but you've got to compare it to the countries that they'd likely to be fighting. Sweden only has 9 million people. So a one-on-one war there, that's not even worth considering. And it's not like Sweden's going to invade Russia. Germany, that could get interesting, but the Germans have to rebuild first. That's going to take a few years. Turkey's probably a more likely candidate, but that conflict is more likely to happen in places like Syria or Georgia. And honestly, the Russians can't power project there. So it would just be, if we got involved, if we had a Turkey-Russia dust up in Syria right now, the Russians would be just humiliated because they honestly, the Turks would probably make their troops walk home. It would just be catastrophic. And then the only other candidate really is China. And the Russians have made it very clear that if it turns into a military conflict between China and Russia, the Russians won't even attempt to meet them tank for tank or plane to plane. They'll just nuke Beijing. So it's not a great picture, but all things considered, it's about as stable as it can be for now. I'm far more concerned about an internal Russian breakup for the next 10, 15 years than I am about somebody actually invading.
Yeah, assume if they're secure in their inner political workings, you don't make Putin president until he's in his late 70s. That's not a sign of long-term faith. But
yeah, and honestly, Putin is probably going to be the last president this country ever has. He's relatively healthy, particularly for his age, particularly compared to the Russian population, and he has deliberately and repeatedly purged his own ranks so that anyone who has any ambition and leadership ambition is removed aggressively. And so you get people that are just basically yes men like Medvedev, who honestly no one would follow under any circumstances. Or Igor Sechin, who everybody loathes, and so who could never rule because Igor Sechin doesn't even have his own inner circle because Putin has purged it.
So, moving on to China. So what are you seeing about China that apparently no one else is? Because any prognosticator in the world right now is saying that's our chief ally, that we need to reignite the Cold War order against China. What are they getting wrong?
Well, Americans really are not happy unless they've got something to stress out about. So honestly, I think a big piece of it is that. And if it comes to a head-to-head competition, which I don't think it will, Americans, I think, are going to be really disappointed with how fast China crumbles. Let's just go down the line. The demographics are awful. 35 years after the one-child policy, the Chinese have run out of 30-year-olds because, that's how math works. Military. The Chinese have optimized their military and built it out with a single purpose: to push back the U.S. Navy from the coast and to enable the capture of Taiwan. That's great. Let's assume for the moment that that's all successful. Okay, what happens on day two? You have an export-import economy that's utterly dependent upon external markets and energy imports, and you have now made everything within 500 miles of the Asian coast a no-go zone for civilian shipping. Sorry. Game over. You have just destroyed your own political economic system. Third, finance. This isn't a capitalist system. This is an Asian investment-driven system where you dump a bottomless supply of capital on into whatever investment project that you think is necessary. You force-feed capital until you get the policy result that you want, whether it's a railroad up inside of a mountain, mass employment, whatever it happens to be. that can work, that can generate growth, but it doesn't generate profits. Now, the U.S. company that has followed this most directly would be Enron. We all remember how that ran. And what China has done is worse than Enron in every single economic subsector. So it's completely overfinanced. It's cruising for a complete economic collapse, regardless of what happens in the global order. That has taken the country's culture by storm, and most of the population has thrown their own personal money into this grow, grow, grow model, which means that we now have something equivalent to the asset-backed securities that triggered our 2007-2000 financial crisis in the hands of Chinese housewives that have invested in condos that no one has ever lived in. So we now have a subprime crisis in China that is probably taking up about 40% of the total housing stock. Subprime here was 3%, just to give you an idea of the scale of the dislocations that are coming. China imports 75% of their oil. Over half of that comes from the Persian Gulf and can only be imported because they are not in a meaningful conflict with Iran or Pakistan or India or Sri Lanka or Thailand or Indonesia or Singapore or Malaysia or Vietnam or the Philippines or Taiwan or the United States or Japan. If any one of those countries changes their position on China strategically, the lights go out, they don't come back on. Probably 60% of their growth is driven by that Enron-style economic development. Another 30% is probably driven by exports. Now, this makes it one of the most insecure countries in the world today, and one that is most dependent upon American strategic largesse simply to be able to function. This is not a story of strength. This is a story of weakness.
So they're basically a giant BBB rated CDO with no oil.
I wouldn't be quite that kind, but yes.
You spent a lot of time talking about the Middle East too in your book, and obviously that's a key component of China's future. I notice of all your countries, Saudi Arabia gets a certain amount of ire compared to how the others are run.
Yeah.
I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about their future. I heard you in another podcast say any group of teenagers could basically take out the Saudi army. So just to give an example of how you feel about them.
Yeah. The Saudi system was basically founded by a group of camel-riding religious zealots who happened completely accidentally into the world's most valuable economic resource. And because they are so incompetent and looking after their own security, they basically cut a deal first with the Brits and ultimately with the Americans. You protect us, we will make sure that the oil flows. And in any environment other than the American-led global order, that would have been a disaster, because it would have marked them as a target for invasion. And since the population centers were not near the oil fields, it would have been a very, very easy haul. In fact, if the United States just stepped back completely and the empires were allowed to rebuild, Saudi Arabia would be on borrowed time. There's no way they could defend themselves. But under the global order, Saudi independence became essential for the American strategy, because without oil, there was no global economics, there was no global trade, there was no global alliance, there was no global security. And so the Americans had to guarantee everything, and that started the most important country in the world then became Saudi Arabia. Well, the U.S. doesn't care anymore. Even if we like the Saudis for who they are, and I don't think anybody likes the Saudis for who they are, the Americans now have the shale revolution, their economy is self-contained, they're on the cusp of being a net importer again, but that's going to be fixed within a year of oil prices going back up. Americans just don't care, which means that the Saudis have to look up for their own interests for the first time, really. And what they've done is kind of hit on a multi-part strategy. Piece one is to take, remember, camel-riding religious zealots. You can only put so many of them in air conditioning before they rebel. So what the Saudis do is they take the most violent of them and just ship them off to countries that they don't care for. They've done this to Pakistan. They've done this to Russia. They've done this to Afghanistan. They've been in Chechnya and Turkey. You name it. Pretty much every country of significance in that part of the world has felt the sting of the Saudi militant exports. This is Al-Qaeda. This is ISIS. Step two, money. It's when you have as much cash lying around as the Saudis have, you can write a lot of checks and underwrite a lot of militant groups that target a lot of people that you don't like. Now, you put these two strategies together, any other tool of state power kind of atrophies, because these are if you've got superpower strategic cover and these are your tools, you don't need an army. In fact, you might not want an army because armies sometimes have opinions about who should be in charge. And if that's not going to be the House of Saud, it's going to be General what's-his-name. So the Saudis have deliberately stunted their own military development for internal security purposes. Now, the situation we're in right now is getting fun. The Americans are leaving. The security cover is gone. Trump supposedly threatened Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, a couple of weeks ago, and this is the first time that the Americans have ever demanded anything of Saudi Arabia, and it really caught them off guard. So we're probably going to be seeing a few security changes in the not-too-distant future. With the Americans leaving, the Saudis know that they have to start developing some more traditional military tools. They don't want to do an army, but they can do an air force. And if you look at the war in Yemen, you'll notice that the Saudis spend a lot of time bombing civilian targets in populated areas, in areas where they have no on-the-ground intel. Now, either the Saudis are just sadists, worth having that conversation, or more likely, it's target practice. The Saudis are preparing for the Iranians rolling south across the deserts. They want to have a great turkey shoot, and that means you have to have an air force that is capable of hitting moving targets. So the first thing you practice on is stationary targets. And honestly, that's really what the war in Yemen is all about. They're just preparing their air force to defend the country when the Iranians ultimately do decide to move. Now, in a war where the Americans are not involved between the Iranians and the Saudis, that 600-mile desert buffer between southern Kuwait and the oil fields, that's a good kill zone. I'd give the Saudis 50-50 chance of pulling it off. And with every day that passes, the Iranians kind of fall more into disrepair. That chances are going up for the Saudis. It's looking pretty good. So if you're like me and you don't really much care for the Saudis' policies or their view on women's rights or human rights or really much of anything about their foreign policy structure, they're going to be with us for a while until 10, 15, 20 years from now, we have regional empires again. And at that point, someone will probably come for them in the night, and there's not a lot that they can do. But between now and then, the Saudis have an opportunity to actually build a military force that's capable of defending the country. But they're not here now, and they're not going to be there soon.
When you talk about Saudi just getting target practice in Yemen, that reminds me a lot of Russia's campaign in Syria, in that they change their commanding officers, I think, every 90 days. They're pretty much designing that as much
Give them
as
his field experience. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, different ends overall. But, when America pulls out of a situation, it's not just that there's a good or bad ending. It's that someone else can just kind of have some fun with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the moral implications of that are not exactly cheery, but, the United States, to be perfectly blunt, did the same thing in Iraqi Kurdistan during the Saddam era for a good 15 years. We would test out our weapon systems there. Now, we would usually pair that with some other goal as opposed to the Saudis and the Russians that are, the goal actually is sharpening the military sword. But the United States is hardly in the clear morally on that point.
No, I don't want to get into an argument about U.S. military. I do want to talk about more just the future under COVID. I do want to ask that as a policy student, and I know we have a lot of students listening to this podcast. What should we learn from this book? What should we learn about how the U.S. will operate in the future global order?
I honestly wouldn't be too worried about the United States. The U.S. is going to take a few years off, probably 20 or 30, and it's probably not going to become involved again until one of two things happens. Number one, the political breakdown of the two parties that started with the Obama administration completes its cycle. So that means what we used to think of as Democrats is gone. What we used to think of as Republicans are gone. The labor unions are no longer Democrats. Fiscal conservatives, military conservatives are no longer Republicans. The Democratic Party is basically a mess that's kind of been hijacked by the far left wing. And the Republican Party has become a vehicle for